This slide has absolutely nothing to do with the presentation, but I thought that it was hilarious. So, like, regardless of what your feelings are on genetically modified food, like, I know that like the images might not be easy for everyone to see because I prepared this like presentation for indoors, and so there might be a bit of a glare. So I'm going to do a bit of reading. This slide just says it's from Snow White. Of course, the Wicked Witch is giving Snow White the apple, and she's like, "This is no ordinary apple. It's a genetically modified apple that never browns. Take a bite." So like I thought that was a great place that like to start that would be a little humorous before we jumped into the actual presentation. But this is the first slide actually, and the presentation was inspired by this question asked by Lauren Ornelas at Food Empowerment Project, and she'd asked this question during her presentation at the Sista Vegan Conference in 2015 when we were discussing the vegan praxis of Black Lives Matter. And the question is, when we say veganism is easy, who do we mean it's easy for? And here's an image of Lauren doing a TED Talk, and this is like Food Empowerment Project, which like I never get tired of talking about because they do such important work. It's a volunteer-run organization, and like they explore the intersections of like of food justice, veganism, and food security. So like like there's so much information on that website that's useful for people regardless of where you're from. It's a US-based organization, but regardless of where you're from, you're going to find something useful there. Like Lauren has done tremendous research with like all of the people who volunteer with FEP, and like they've compiled all of this information on food justice, on migrant workers. I didn't know until I had started like listening to her and following her work that the average life expectancy of a strawberry picker is like 49 years old. And as someone who's vegan, like that really resonates with me because like it opened me up to an entirely different set of like of values that like that I wanted to be consistent with my veganism, because for me it's justice for the animals, but it's also justice across the board, because if we, like as Roger pointed out, liberation for one group is meaningless if it's not liberation for everyone. They also have done like a lot of work into researching not just food insecurity, but like also slave chocolate. A lot of us don't know that the chocolate that we consume in the Western world, whether it's vegan or not, it's not cruelty free, because a large portion of it is like it's procured through slavery, direct slavery. And we're not talking about like slavery is like some euphemism for something else. No, real slavery. And like that was very unsettling for me to learn. So like definitely check out the website. It's www.foodispower.org. And like and research like like as much as you can, and learn about Food Empowerment Project and the important work that they do. Of course, when Lauren asked that question, like she was asking it in terms of like people in Western society saying that like when veganism is like veganism is easy, who is it easy for? She meant it in terms of like like it may be easy for us in this room, or in this tent, as the case may be, like but is it necessarily easy for the like woman in South America who's working for 7 cents a day to pick our organic tomatoes? Probably not, and for a myriad of reasons. But it really started me along a path of interrogating like whether or not veganism is necessarily easy for everyone in our Western society. And so when I started asking that question, I came up with a lot more questions rather than answers. And so we have this presentation here, which I call veganism is easy, except for when it isn't, because sometimes it's not easy. And like and we explore kind of why. What does it mean to live in a food desert? That is one of the first questions that I came across. And like surprisingly, when I asked that question, a lot of people, like when I talk about it online, I'm not joking about this. A lot of people think that it is an actual desert. A food desert does not look like this. Perhaps it does for some people, but like that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a physical place that has lots of sand and no water and no food. Like a food desert, after I got through looking like this and answering that question, I try to explain to people that like a food desert looks kind of like this. No, still not sand, but like it's not about a physical location, like out in actual desert, but it's about like lack of accessibility to like healthy food items and healthy food options. Now, some people will say like, well, not everybody can be vegan because some people live in food deserts, and that's not the responsibility of veganism. It's unfair to like, make that accusation about veganism. We need food justice, and we need accessibility to healthy food, whether you're vegan or not. Hopefully everybody is vegan. Like when we look at this long term, we want everyone to be vegan. That should be like the expectation, and violence against animals should not be the case. But like, whether you're vegan or not, accessibility to healthy food should be like, a basic right for all of us. And we kind of think like, well, if someone lives in a food desert, that just means that like, that they're not buying healthy food. If you were living in a food desert and you don't have access to like, consistent access to groceries to buy your own food, it's not like, it's not like I go to the grocery store and like I'm so poor that like I buy the most expensive items there, which are often meat and dairy. No, it means oftentimes that like I'm so poor that like I can't afford to go to the grocery store at all. And that dollar menu starts to look really tempting to a lot of people. And this isn't an excuse to not be vegan, but it's just helping us to have an understanding of where people are when we initiate our conversations about veganism, because some people are approaching it from the mindset that like, this is what I can afford, this is what's familiar to me, and this is what I can like, what I'm intent on continuing to do because it's part of my basic survival. That dollar menu, yeah, like I used to be there myself until I started educating myself, which is itself a privilege. Here's a definition about food deserts that like, that is again pulled from the Food Empowerment Project website. It says here, and again, like I said, I'll read it because I know that not everybody can see this, and perhaps the folks at home might not be able to see it either. Food deserts can be described as geographic areas where residents' access to affordable, healthy food options, especially fresh fruits and vegetables, is restricted or non-existent due to the absence of grocery stores within convenient traveling distance. For instance, according to a report prepared for Congress by the Economic Research Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, about 2.3 million people, or 2.2% of all U.S. households, live more than 1 mile away from a supermarket and do not own a car. I can tell you about a time, actually, like within the past 6 months, when I was conducting my own personal research about this. I was staying with a friend in in rural Illinois, like 90 minutes outside of Chicago, which Chicago, while, that itself is a metro center, like in DeKalb County, like, there are like some limitations to access. When this friend said that like, he was interested in going vegan, I happened to be in a position where I could go and like, and coach him personally for a couple of weeks. And when I got there, I thought that this was going to be like easy because I had like a list of all of my favorite recipes, like, I knew what to make, and I wanted to make sure that like all of the things that I made were easily accessible. And like, it sounded like a great idea on the surface. The very first day he went to work and like I stayed at home. I'm a copy editor. I get to do my job from like, from wherever I can open my laptop. And, I said to him, okay, while you're gone, I'm going to do some grocery shopping. And like, this seemed easy. He took the car. I was staying in the house, and I said, well, let me find out where the nearest grocery store is. It was approximately 7 miles away, and I said, all right, that's not too far. Public transportation was non-existent for me, so that was already out. Since, like, he had taken the car, I couldn't drive myself, so I said, maybe I can call a taxi, which, again, is itself a privilege because, like, I have enough money to catch a taxi to a grocery store and back. I called the taxi service, and the guy said, I'm booked. And I said, all right, then send somebody else. And he's like, I don't think you understand, pal. Listen, Chief, I am the taxi service for this county. And I'm booked for the next 4 hours. And I'm like, whoa, okay, that is like, for me as a person who was living in New York, that just seemed like that was so hard for me to wrap my head around. And like his primary business was like taking people back and forth to the train station so that they could get to their jobs in the city, which again, Chicago was 90 minutes away. And so like, that was his business, which is great for him. Like he saturated, like, he's cornered the market on like, on this service. But like for me, I'm like, well, I'm stuck in the house. Maybe I'll just get on my mobile phone and look for an Uber. Uber doesn't exist in DeKalb County, like in Illinois. So I'm like, okay, great. My last option is to walk to the grocery store, which again, I'm an able-bodied person. It's a privilege. And like I said, even if I walk to the grocery store, looking at the route on my computer, it was not a walkable distance. Like, I say that I can walk 7 miles, but can I walk 7 miles while carrying grocery bags back from the grocery store? And how many groceries am I going to be able to carry? How many times a week would I have to do that if I'm a single parent? How many times a week would I have to do that if I, like, if I wasn't an able-bodied person? And like, and realistically speaking, even being an able-bodied person, looking at the route, like this county wasn't set up for people who were walking great distances. This county wasn't set up for people who were walking at all. There weren't sidewalks, and there were some major highways that were like, on the walking route. And like, and looking at that, I was like living, although in like, a fairly equitable area, I was living in a food desert during this 2 weeks. So I waited for my friend to come home, and that was like, that was a great like introduction to like his veganism, because he was expecting for me to like have like this 3-course meal laid out, and that didn't happen. So we had to go to the grocery store together using the car. Which, like, you know, if he didn't have a car, we would be completely hosed. And so, like, you know, the nearest place that was in walking distance was a 7-Eleven. And for those of you who don't know, that's an American convenience store that didn't have a whole wealth of vegan options. And so, like, this was very hard. And here's the other kicker. Even after we were able to buy these groceries and bring them home, all of the equipment that I had just completely taken for granted, having a food processor is a luxury. Having a high-speed blender or having a blender at all is a luxury. And in this household, like, I don't want to put him on Front Street, but oh boy, like in this household, he didn't have a cutting board or even decent knives. And so, like, you know, that was like, you know, for me, that was so basic, but that's not basic for everybody. And that existed completely outside of my frame of reference. That was outside my consciousness because I had been so used to having that privilege for so long. So this is realistically what it looks like for a lot of people, not just me. And I'm sure for a lot of people that we're talking about here. Healthier foods, this is another quote from Food Empowerment Project's website. Healthier foods are generally more expensive than unhealthful foods, particularly in food deserts. For instance, while the overall price of fruits and vegetables in the United States increased by nearly 75% between 1989 and 2005, the price of fatty foods dropped by more than 26% during the same period. That is absurd. That is a complete failure of everybody in Congress, everybody in our political system, and indeed of ourselves who have the privilege to like advocate for those who have less than us. And like, you know, it is like, you know, it's appalling that like fatty foods, the price of them dropped, while healthier foods, the foods that we're used to having, like, you know, increased so dramatically in that time period. And just in case you were thinking that, like, okay, this is a U.S. phenomenon, it doesn't affect people in the U.K. Here are some statistics as well. It says here, 1 in 5 parents in the U.K. is struggling to feed their children, new research has revealed. The research shows more than 20% of parents have skipped meals, gone without food to feed their children, or relied on family members or friends for food in the last 12 months. That's right here in the U.K. The research carried out by Tesco, the food bank's charity, the Trussell Trust, and food redistribution charity FareShare comes as the 3 organizations prepare to hold the biggest ever food collection in the UK on the 5th and 6th of July. That was in 2015. 70% of families suffering from food poverty with children in primary school education rely in some part on food supplied by schools, either through free school meals or food given out by breakfast or after-school clubs. So sometimes your reliance is on the system. And like, you know, food insecurity impacts so many people and we don't think about it. Sometimes it's not about like buying the food yourself. It's about relying on like, you know, on food programs within our education system to feed our families. And guess what? They're not giving out soy milk. That's not subsidized by schools. They're not giving out vegan food. It's often unhealthy food that, like, you know, that these families are relying on that's not vegan. And so, like, you know, it's not necessarily like, okay, I have access to buy food myself. It's sometimes like, you know what, the system that we're relying on to feed us is not a vegan system. It's not an equitable system for humans. It's not an equitable system for the animals who are exploited and disenfranchised. And this is, you know, this is the reality of families that are living with food insecurity. And so, you know, you're going to have people that are saying, like this fine gentleman, that's not the animal's fault, Sebastian. And indeed, it's not the animal's fault. But we are, again, I'm just going to remind us all, we're talking about some of the challenges that people face in going vegan. And this is about like changing our activism to meet those challenges and understand where people are coming from. Understand that everyone is not like us in this room. Everyone doesn't enjoy the same level of privilege. It says here you need to stop. When people say that, you need to remind them that this is like, you know, you've got to chill. Oh yeah, this is an interesting slide that I included here. This is from Time magazine. It says the rich are different. More money equals less empathy. People sometimes ask me why I like have such a heavy focus on people who experience food insecurity or families who are living with poverty, like in my activism. Not only is it the right thing to do because I'm not a shitty individual, but like, you know, but when we like, you know, are looking at people in the mainstream community, like people who are generally well off, they actually have less empathy, and this has been like sociologically proven. So there's a lot of sense in gearing our activism toward disenfranchised communities, to people who are suffering more than we are, because those people actually have greater empathy, and those people are more given to understanding the need for solidarity between social justice movements. And we are going to need the support of other people in different social justice movements if we're going to be successful. And that's across the board, whether we're talking about racial justice, whether we're talking about animal justice, whether we're talking about gender justice, regardless of the situation, there needs to be solidarity, because so many of us we experience these intersecting oppressions. And as Roger had pointed out, thank you again for your presentation, that this is about times. It's your oppression is multiplied by by experiencing these situations concurrently. And this is a bit about the research that explains that how people are how people who have less money or who are less financially well off have more empathy. This is from Scientific American, and it says here on this side, a set of studies published by Dakar Keltner, and I hope that I pronounced that name correctly, and his colleagues last year looked at how social class influences feelings of compassion toward people who are suffering. In one study, they found that less affluent individuals are more likely to report feeling compassion towards others on a regular basis. For example, they're more likely to agree with statements such as, "I often notice people who need help," and "it's important to take care of people who are vulnerable." This was true even after controlling for other factors that we know affect compassionate feelings, such as gender, ethnicity, and spiritual beliefs. Then it goes on to say, even the growing income inequality in the United States, given the growing income inequality in the United States, the relationship between wealth and compassion has important implications. Those who hold most of the power in this country, political and otherwise, tend to come from privileged backgrounds. If social class influences how much we care about others, then the most powerful among us may be the least likely to make decisions that help the needy and the poor. This includes animals, by the way. The people who hold the most power are the least invested in in the welfare of everyone else. They may also be the most likely to engage in unethical behavior. And this is you can look up this research yourself. This, like I said, came from Scientific American, but there have been multiple sociological studies that have been done that that really come to the conclusion that the more power, influence, wealth you have in our society, the less likely you are to care about those who are lacking in those things. People from different disenfranchised communities and other animals. And so we can't rely on people who already have a lot to give a damn about those who don't have a lot. So we're all in this together. My liberation is tied up in the liberation of every other being around here, whether they are human or non-human. And people who are a part of, as they say, the 1%, they don't have that understanding. They don't have that that cultural experience, and they're lacking in empathy oftentimes. So we don't focus our efforts on them. There are other reasons as well that are going to influence, whether or not people go vegan, and how people react to our advocacy when we're having conversations with them, and these situations also contribute to I say, vegan regression or vegan recidivism, because some people want to go vegan and some people do go vegan, but they end up going back. And why? Because there's an enormous amount of social isolation and financial dependence that we often don't consider or take into consideration in our activism. Work situations. I was actually having a conversation with a friend just last night. She was at work, and and there were two people who were in supervisory positions over her that were having a conversation about, if I can believe this, about what makes a better handbag, crocodile skin or elephant skin. And she was so effing angry because she's listening to this conversation and she's vegan. And she's disempowered by this situation, because what can she actually say? When you're in a situation listening to people who who have more privilege than you, who are in supervisory positions over you, you feel directly disempowered by this, and that's enormously discouraging. That's not a fun place to be in. Family situations. Food insecurity in terms of reliance on other parents, partners, and other people. We have this expectation that you can go vegan and and it's going to be easy, because we oftentimes assume that people are paying for their own food. When you're a teenager, you're usually and you make this tremendous decision to go vegan, you're not oftentimes in a situation where you get to choose the food that you eat. I know that I had gone vegetarian a couple of times during my teenage years, vegetarian, not vegan. And like, and I had this conversation with my mom because I was like all fired up about it and everything. She's like, well, you eat what you want, but like I'm cooking this, so like, you eat what's served to you. That's the attitude of a lot of our parents. Hi, Mom. Hi. Sorry about that. She's cool now, though. We've come a long way. But like, but like, what the partners of spouses who like, who don't work and who are not the ones who are bringing home the income, they're oftentimes disempowered by their situations because they're not making the decisions about like, about what food is brought into the house, and that's that's not an easy position for someone to occupy. And like, I've had people tell me before, not all vegans, and like I know a person who like who was vegan and through insurmountable odds it was great for. Wonderful, I'm glad that you know that person, but that's not the statistical reality for a lot of people. Like that's not how this works for everyone. I'm glad that your person was able to make it work, but we're talking about making this work for everybody, not just individuals who were able to like overcome their situations in order to be successful at this. We want to make sure that everybody's able to do it. And again, like if I can borrow from like other social justice movements, like people take like the election of Barack Obama as a black president to mean like, oh well, like he overcame the odds and look, he's president of the United States. Guess what? There are people that are black in the United States being shot every day by a militarized police. That's not the reality for everyone. Well done, Barack Obama. You're president, but you're a president in a country that like, that still largely upholds like white supremacist values and like in a system that not just disenfranchises like black Americans, but also like, people around the globe that are susceptible, that are vulnerable to like an imperialist culture and a country that exercises like, this massive power of globalization. So yeah, like there's like, I went off on a tangent there. I do that sometimes. I apologize. Here's another thing that everyone like, how many people have said to someone, myself included, like, rice and beans are cheap. Like, so it's, everybody can eat rice and beans and like, and that sorts out that problem. No, it doesn't. Like, yes, rice and beans are cheap. I eat it all the time. I'm poor myself. Like, this is, I don't lead a very glamorous lifestyle, despite what some of you may have been told. Like, so it's a great dish. But, like, but poor people deserve more than rice and beans. Like, let's be realistic here. Like, yes, I eat it out of necessity. And, like, and the animal shouldn't pay for, like, the problems that have been created, the problems of resource distribution and food inequality that have been created by humans. But the reality of the situation is that, like, that's not how most of the world looks at it. And so, again, I'm not making excuses for people to not be vegan. I'm just helping us to understand and realize where other people are when we're like, when we're advocating for veganism. Yeah, like when people come with the rice and beans, I literally can't. So like this is just a slide expressing like, my frustration at this. We also need to understand food preparation as a privilege. What does it mean to be time rich? Like for me, I've learned that like, I post recipes online. I have like food albums on social media. I'm sure most of us do, where we post our like, our favorite things that we make and we share our vegan food. But what I often did not think about when I was posting my food albums is the amount of time that goes into preparing some of the food that I post. Sometimes I'll spend hours like, making dishes. Sometimes I spend as little as 45 minutes. But you know what? I'm in a position where I am myself time rich. Sometimes privilege isn't strictly a financial thing. Oftentimes privilege is like, having the ability to spend a lot of time preparing food. Again, sometimes folks are working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet, and they don't have the same access to time that I do in order to make a lot of dishes and in order to like, to do these things. And so, yeah, again, we go back to that dollar menu, which like seems really attractive to folks that are under that sort of pressure. But so it then becomes incumbent upon us, again, this isn't an excuse, but like, helping people to realize that this is what we're looking at. It becomes incumbent upon us to help people like, find fast, easy dishes that they're able to make that don't cost a bunch, that won't break the bank, that, that is nutritious, that does help them, and making that available to other people as well. So it's not just the pretty things that like, that we spend hours making and plating and getting the lighting just right so that we can take the picture for it. Like, it's also the fast and easy things, and we need to bear that in mind when we're advocating our veganism to other people. And so, like, people will often also ask me, what do you want me to do? Like, here are the takeaways that I want you to, like, get out of this presentation. I like wrote online recently three reasons why I stopped telling people online to educate themselves about oppression. Oftentimes, as social justice advocates, we get frustrated like when people are asking a lot of questions, and it's like, you know what, go look it up yourself, go research it yourself. I am like, I'm not in a place where like I feel like doing this for the umpteenth time. Just bear in mind that for a lot of people, this is their first time asking them. We need to treat them as though this is the first time that we've heard this question, even though it might be like the 90th time that we've heard it that day. Regardless of how many times we may have even heard it like over the course of a lifetime, it may be the first time for that person. So giving them the benefit of the doubt. These are the reasons why I stopped telling people to just educate themselves. Knowing how to conduct a search and objectively evaluate the information you find is itself a privilege, and thinking everyone has the capacity to do that is a huge assumption. So, when we tell people to go and research things themselves, they can't always do that. We can't always trust the results that they're going to come back with. If you ask people to research whether or not the Earth is flat, they're going to bring their their biases into that kind of. The Earth is not flat, by the way. I don't want anybody to. Please, if you're, and the folks at home too, I don't want you taking away that the Earth is flat from this presentation. This is going to get me a lot of backlash on social media because I know some people who think that it is. But we're gonna bring our biases to that conversation. We're gonna bring our biases to our searches, regardless of what the topic is veganism healthy? Is something that I'm probably going to look up. Is veganism unhealthy? Is something that that a meat lobbyist is probably going to look up. And we're both going to have dramatically different results. Hell, even our searches, Google is gonna return things to us based on our previous searches, based on what Google thinks we want to see. So there's a huge level of bias there that we want to eliminate by by helping people along the way rather than sending them off to do research on their own. Number two, Google is like an evil genie. If you don't make exactly the correct wish when you rub the search engine and click go, you'll get exactly what you wished for. And that's almost always a bias supporting catastrophe that goes hand in hand with number one. Depending on what you type in, even if you miss a certain word, what you type into a Google search has a tremendous impact on what the results are going to be. And and just like a genie, Google is going to return what it thinks you want to see. And everything is usually based on confirmation bias. None of us are completely objective, but we can help people to find more objective, more reliable information if we're if we're invested in their success by helping them rather than sending them off to do it on their own. And number three, this is specific to educating people online, which I know a lot of us do. We're going to leave this this talk today, and we're going to go to our social media platforms, and we're going to have conversations with our significant others, our family, our friends, all the people in our network. When educating people online, sometimes the people we're directly talking to are going to mansplain, whitesplain, humansplain away all their privilege. In fact, they almost always will. But bear in mind that we don't always just educate for that person. Sometimes when we're sharing information online, when we're having conversations online, we share information for the 50 plus other people on that YouTube video comment thread or that Facebook thread who are reading and watching in silence. I can't tell you how many people that I didn't even know were reading conversations that would inbox me weeks and sometimes months later. And sometimes they do it immediately, but I don't know because it got filtered out. But but they say that hey, I read what you wrote and I read the link that you shared and or I watched the video that you posted and that had a tremendous effect on me. So even if the people that we're talking to directly are not receptive, and whether we're talking to them online or whether we're talking to them in person, there are still people around who are hearing that conversation. Before we came today to VegFest, we actually had we stopped, me and my two friends, and we had coffee in a coffee house where there was a gorgeous little offen pincher just walking around. And when people who know me personally know that one of my pet peeves is is purebred dogs because of the number of the number of shelter animals that there are that often get put down. And so I was having a very loud conversation with my friends about about why it's important to adopt instead of shop. And regardless of whether or not the owner of that dog was listening, there were still other people that may or may not be impacted by that conversation. So we educate not just for the person or persons that we're directly talking to, but also for the people that are that are tangentially related to that conversation or in the proximity of that conversation. And the obligatory disclaimer, if you're going through racial battle fatigue, gendered violence, or other trauma, this advice is definitely not for you. Like, you know what? We don't always have a responsibility to educate. And I don't want anybody, like, you know, walking out of here and saying, like, well, Sebastian said that I have to. No, Sebastian didn't say that you have to do all of these things. If you're actually going through something, if you are emotionally distressed, sometimes we're not always in a position to be the best advocates that we can be, and that's okay. So, like, you know, take a break, recharge, like, you know, go through some radical self-healing, whatever that may look like for you, and come back ready to have those conversations. I see a lot of activists that, like, you know, that get burnt out, that get frustrated, and, like, you know, and they're not in a place to be the best advocate that they can be, and it's not their time to advocate. And I see that frustration come out in their education efforts, and, like, you know, I you know, and it saddens me because, like, this is a person who obviously is in need of healing themselves, and, like, you know, and they're still out here trying to fight for animals, and, like, you know, that happens to a lot of famous advocates. Like, you know, we see, I'm not going to name names, but, like, all of us are familiar with someone who's, like, you know, who's spoken out of turn, because, like, it's really difficult. Like, when you see what happens to animals every day, all the time, and the capacity for, like, you know, for torture and violence and exploitation that we can be responsible for as humans, it's really, really hard not to get jaded and not to become bitter about that. But when that does happen to us, and it will happen to all of us at some point, take a step back and, like, you know, and try to find your center again before you go back out there and try to advocate, because, like, it's going to be, like, it's not going to be helpful for your advocacy. It's not going to be necessarily helpful for the people you're talking to. And I know all of us know someone who says, well, like, you know what, somebody got in my face one time, they were real mad at me, and they screamed and hollered at me, and I went vegan because of that. That's not how it works for the most of us, okay? I'm sorry, like, you know, that experience may have worked for you. That doesn't work for everybody. So, like, well done for you that you went vegan because someone screamed at your face. But, like, you know what, my best teachers in school, the ones who helped me through my, like, you know, my primary school education and my secondary education, they were not the ones who were screaming at me. They were the ones who were, like, that were understanding, that were helping me, that, like, that met me where I was. And that's how we become, like, better advocates for the animals. So thank you all for coming out. If you got quick, thank you for the applause.